Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events, issues, and things. The things we are analyzing today are American city landmarks. For this episode, I am not counting buildings. There are several cities that have iconic buildings, such as the Empire State Building in New York City or the Sears Tower in Chicago. And before anybody wants to correct me, yes, I am aware that since 2009, the real name is the Willis Tower. But I have close friends, like my college roommate, who live in Chicago, and they all insist that everybody in the Windy City refuses to call it the Willis Tower and will only refer to it as the Sears Tower. I also did not want to include practical structures, even though they are sometimes the most recognizable thing in a city. A perfect example is the Golden Gate Bridge is probably the most iconic man-made item in San Francisco. No, for this episode, I wanted to just examine monuments which are not functional, but are there mostly for their presence. These are structures which are there to be looked at. When you see these structures in a movie, you immediately know the city. The first landmark is my favorite monument in the entire country, the Statue of Liberty. I have climbed to the crown of the Statue of Liberty 11 times. That's right, 11 times. A lot of those were trips when I was a kid growing up in Connecticut, about 20 miles outside of New York City. The Statue of Liberty was a gift to the people of the United States from the people of France. That is utterly remarkable. Can you imagine that occurring today? Really? Can you imagine the people from any country today giving another country a gift of this magnitude? It's one of the many things that makes the Statue of Liberty unique. So how did this amazing gift come about? During the American Revolution, the French had been allies of the Americans. In the mid-1800s, a lot of French still felt a kinship to the U.S. In 1865, a Frenchman named Edouard de la Boulaye came up with the idea of presenting a monumental gift from the people of France to the people of the United States to commemorate the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. And let's be clear, this was from the people of France, not the government of France. De la Boulaye was president of the French Anti-Slavery Society, an admirer of Abraham Lincoln, and was impressed with the recent abolition of slavery in the United States. De la Boulaye proposed his idea to many of his influential friends and acquaintances. One of those people was a sculptor named Frederic Auguste Bartholdi. Bartholdi liked the idea and thought that a giant statue would be the appropriate monument. Bartholdi was inspired by the Colossus of Rhodes. That was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was a statue of the Greek sun god Helios. The Colossus of Rhodes stood by the entrance to the harbor on the Greek island of Rhodes. The Colossus was completed somewhere around 280 BCE. It did not last very long. The giant statue collapsed in an earthquake around 226 BCE. Supposedly, it had been around 110 feet tall. Bartholdi's design for the Statue of Liberty was that of a woman in a robe wearing a crown with 7 spikes. Some people claim that the spikes represent the 7 continents, but it appears that the number is just a coincidence, and Bartholdi simply designed the crown to look like rays of sunshine. There is a broken shackle and chains at the statue's feet, symbolizing the end of slavery. In her left hand, she is holding a tablet which is inscribed with the date of the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776, but it's written in Roman numerals. In her right hand, she's holding a torch, and that is why the actual name of the statue is Liberty Enlightening the World. This was a great idea, but who was going to pay for it? Bartholdi came to the U.S. to generate support for the project. The proposal from de la Boulaye and Bartholdi was that the people of France would pay for and build the statue if the people of the United States would build the pedestal. Surely the statue is the coolest part, but the pedestal is not a token element. The Statue of Liberty is 305 feet tall in total. The statue itself is 151 feet tall, and the pedestal is 154 feet tall. So the pedestal is half of the structure. The French were more enthusiastic in paying for their share of the project, but the U.S. had a little trouble raising the funds for the American share. The American Committee for the Statue of Liberty was a private organization that tried to raise money to build the pedestal. It was estimated that somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000 would be necessary to construct the pedestal. The money was raised by private donations. The United States government did not pay anything for the Statue of Liberty. Congress refused to pay. Most of the money raised was from wealthy Americans. To create interest, the right hand holding the torch was sent from France to Philadelphia for the 1876 centennial celebration. It was hoped that this would help raise money. The New Colossus is a sonnet by American poet Emma Lazarus. She wrote the poem for an auction to raise money for the construction of the pedestal in 1883. In 1903, her sonnet was cast into a bronze plaque and mounted inside the pedestal's lower level, where it remains today. Unfortunately, Emma Lazarus died in 1887 at the age of 38, a year after the Statue of Liberty opened. She probably died of Hodgkin's lymphoma. She never got to go to Liberty Island to see the statue. Envisioning an even larger statue in New York Harbor than the Colossus of Rhodes, which I described earlier, Emma Lazarus named her poem The New Colossus. The poem is short, since by definition a sonnet has only 14 lines, and here it is.
Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
No, that was not the voice of Emma Lazarus you just heard. That was my wife Cindy, who I appreciate helping me in this episode. You might have noticed that in her poem, Emma Lazarus references the Twin Cities. With apologies to Minneapolis and St. Paul, in the 1800s, the Twin Cities meant New York and Brooklyn. Brooklyn was still a separate city. In the 1880 census, New York was by far the largest city in the country by population. The independent city of Brooklyn was the third largest city in the country. And I know you're dying to know which city was in between, and the answer is Philadelphia was the second largest city in the U.S. in 1880. At the time of the 1880 census, New York City was limited to the island of Manhattan and a small section of what is now the Bronx. The 5 boroughs of Manhattan, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island did not consolidate into the expanded city of New York until January 1, 1898. Even with the help of people like Emma Lazarus, the American Committee for the Statue of Liberty Enlightening the World had run out of money. So Joseph Pulitzer came to the rescue. You've probably heard of his name because of the Pulitzer Prize. Actually, there are Pulitzer Prizes across 22 categories in journalism and the arts awarded every year. In the 1880s, Pulitzer was the owner of the New York World, one of the largest newspapers in the country. In an article in his own newspaper on March 16, 1885, Joseph Pulitzer argued, "We must raise the money. The World is the people's paper, and now it appeals to the people to come forward and raise the money. The $250,000 that the making of the statue cost was paid in by the masses of the French people, by the working men, the tradesmen, the shop girls, the artisans, by all, irrespective of class or condition. Let us respond in like manner. Let us not wait for the millionaires of America, but a gift of the whole people of France to the whole people of America." That article did the trick. The money started pouring in. In a brilliant move, as donations came in, Pulitzer published the name of every single person who gave money, no matter how small the amount. Besides listing their names, Pulitzer included the details that the contributors sent to him about why they were donating or how they'd come up with the money. 5 months later, by August 11, 1885, approximately 125,000 Americans contributed over $100,000 to the New York World. Most of the donations were $1 or less. As a result of Pulitzer's efforts, the pedestal was completed. So where was this giant statue going to be placed? On his trip to America in 1871, Bartholdi, the sculptor who would build the statue, went to several cities including Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and New York. Bartholdi wanted to locate the statue in New York City, and he wanted to situate it someplace in the harbor since most visitors and immigrants entered the United States through New York Harbor. Bartholdi found the spot he wanted on a small island in upper New York Harbor called Bedloe's Island. That island was owned by the federal government. In the early 1800s, a stone fort was constructed on Bedloe's Island in the shape of an 11-point star. By the 1880s, that fort was obsolete and no longer of use to the federal government. That stone fort became the distinctive base of the Statue of Liberty. In 1956, an act of Congress renamed Bedloe's Island as Liberty Island. The location of Liberty Island is just perfect. It was the ideal symbol of freedom for all of the 12 million immigrants that went through Ellis Island from 1892 until it closed in 1954. To get to Ellis Island, those ships passed right in front of the Statue of Liberty. My maternal grandparents passed through Ellis Island when they came from Italy in 1905 and 1913. I really wish that I had asked them what they thought when they saw the Statue of Liberty. How is the statue constructed? The statue is made out of copper and is only 2.4 millimeters thick. That is less than the thickness of 2 American pennies. Most people know that the Statue of Liberty is green, but it was not always so. When the statue was dedicated in 1886, it was brown, the color of a penny, because it was made out of copper. It took about 20 years for oxidation to change the color to green by the early 1900s. The statue is made in separate pieces of copper. Each copper piece has iron straps on the inside to support the copper pieces. When put together, the copper pieces would not be able to sustain their own weight, so a steel structure was required for the inside. This was designed by Gustav Eiffel. And if that name sounds familiar, yes, he's the guy who built the Eiffel Tower in Paris a few years later, which was opened in 1889. The Statue of Liberty has an iron tower in the center of the statue. It's kind of like the spine of the statue, and then support beams go out from that iron tower, and the copper pieces are attached to those support beams. After it was built in France, the statue was disassembled into 350 separate pieces and shipped to New York City. From the time that the statue first opened through today, people can climb up to the crown. The National Park Service warns people that it is equal to climbing up a 20-story building. That includes climbing the pedestal. There are a total of 377 steps from the entrance lobby to the platform in the crown of the statue. Climbing the pedestal is the relatively easy part. There are 215 steps to climb to the top of the pedestal, essentially equal to climbing a 10-story building. There's an elevator in the pedestal, but it could have a long wait. There's a large outdoor balcony on the top of the pedestal just below the statue's feet. There are fantastic 360-degree views of New York Harbor and Manhattan. The reason why I say that climbing the pedestal is the easy part is because of the temperatures. All of the times that I've climbed the Statue of Liberty were in the summer. The pedestal is made out of stone and is nice and cool in there. But when you get to the statue, it is extremely hot in the summer. You are inside a large copper structure which retains the heat. There's no air conditioning, and the only windows are those tiny windows in the crown of the statue. It is usually 15 to 20 degrees hotter inside the statue than the outside air temperature. To climb to the crown, you go up the double helix stairway. There are 2 intertwined spiral staircases, one going up and one going down. The stairs are right in the middle of that iron support structure that I described as the spine of the statue. This is a one-way situation. Once you start climbing, you have to go all the way to the top to the crown, and then you come down the other intertwined stairwell back to the pedestal. Now that I've given you the downsides, I would still highly recommend climbing all the way to the crown. I think it is the best thing you can do on a visit to New York City. As you climb up 162 steps in a tight spiral staircase, you can see the inside of the statue. There are great views of the metal framework designed by Gustav Eiffel. And you can see the copper pieces of the statue from the inside. You can even see the ripples of the statue's robe. It is magnificent. And when you get to the top and you are inside the statue's head and you can look out of the windows in her crown, you get to look down at the tablet in her left hand and get a close-up view of the torch. When the statue was first opened, people could go up the right arm all the way to the torch. This ended on July 30, 1916. On that date, German spies blew up the Black Tom Railroad Yard in New Jersey. This was during World War I. The U.S. did not enter the World War until April 1917, but in the summer of 1916, the United States was supplying Britain with materials for the war. The explosion was so large that it shattered windows in Manhattan and caused damage to the right arm of the Statue of Liberty. As a result, the public has not been able to go up to the torch of the statue since 1916. However, National Park Service workers do have to go up to the torch sometimes for maintenance. The Statue of Liberty Enlightening the World was dedicated on October 28, 1886. Approximately 1 million people watched the ceremony from around New York Harbor as the artist who created the statue, Bartholdi, released the tricolor flag that veiled Lady Liberty's face. There was an extensive renovation of the statue in the 1980s, and today the statue still looks great. Approximately 3.5 million people visit the Statue of Liberty every year. I'm now going to switch from the area where I grew up to the city where I've lived most of my life, Los Angeles. The most iconic landmark in Southern California is the Hollywood sign. Hollywood is a section of Los Angeles. In 1903, Hollywood was incorporated as a separate city, but in 1910, Hollywood was consolidated into the growing city of Los Angeles. In the early days of the film industry, several studios were located in or around Hollywood. That is why the name Hollywood is now synonymous with show business. Many people assume that the Hollywood sign is related to the movie industry. Not true. The Hollywood sign started as an advertisement for a housing development. When it was erected in 1923, the sign said Hollywood Land. That was all one word, and that was the name of the housing development. The sign is located on the south face of Mount Lee and the Santa Monica Mountains above Hollywood. The sign has changed over the years. When it was first built, it was lit up by approximately 4,000 20-watt light bulbs. The sign would light up in sequence. First Holly, then Wood, then Land, and then the entire sign would light up as Hollywood Land. The original letters were 45 feet tall and 30 feet wide. When the land developer put up the sign, it was only expected to last for about a year or two. The original letters were made out of sheet metal supported by wood scaffolding. The company which was developing the housing project, called Hollywood Land, went out of business and simply abandoned the sign. By 1949, the city of Los Angeles owned the property where the Hollywood Land sign was situated. In 1949, the Chamber of Commerce for Hollywood and the city of Los Angeles renovated the sign in 2 ways. Number 1, they removed the last 4 letters, which read Land. So now the sign simply read Hollywood. Number 2, they removed the lights from the sign because the city of LA did not want to replace all of the lighting and did not want to pay for the electricity to light up the letters. By the 1970s, the sign was in terrible shape. The third letter O was gone, and the other letters looked very battered. A campaign was led by the founder of Playboy magazine, Hugh Hefner, for a major restoration of the Hollywood sign. The decaying old letters were torn down and were replaced with new 45-foot tall steel letters paid for by private funds. 9 donors each contributed $27,777. Each contribution of that amount sponsored one letter in the sign. Here are the people and entities who paid for each letter. The H was paid for by publisher Terrence Donnelly. The first O was paid for by producer Giovanni Mazza. The first L was sponsored by Kelly Blue Book founder Les Kelly. The second L was sponsored by country singer and actor Gene Autry. The Y was paid for by Hugh Hefner. The W was paid for by singer Andy Williams. The second O was paid for by Warner Brothers Records. The third O was sponsored by rocker Alice Cooper. And the D was paid for by private citizen Thomas Pooley. Instead of wood scaffolding, the new Hollywood sign is now supported by steel. There is no permanent lighting for the sign. However, external lighting was used on the Hollywood sign during the 1984 Olympic Games and also on New Year's Eve, ringing in the year 2000. And in the summer of 2022, the sign was lit up for the BET, Black Entertainment Television, award show. But it wasn't the sign being lit up so you could read Hollywood. There were images and words projected onto the sign. There's a famous and tragic story tied to the Hollywood sign. Peg Entwistle was a British actress who moved to LA. Her career did not really pan out, and she only appeared in one film called 13 Women. She never got to see herself in that movie because it was released after her death. In September 1932, Peg Entwistle was living with her uncle in Beechwood Canyon, a section of the Hollywood Hills below the Hollywoodland sign. On September 16, Peg told her uncle that she was going out to meet with friends. She did not return. 2 days later, on September 18, 1932, a woman was hiking in the Hollywood Hills below the Hollywoodland sign. She found a woman's shoe, a purse, and a jacket. She opened the purse and found a suicide note signed with the initials P.E. She looked around and saw a woman's body in a ravine below the sign. The hiker delivered what she found to the Hollywood police station. The police retrieved the body but could not identify the dead woman. The suicide note was published in the newspapers, and her uncle saw the article and went to the police. He identified the dead woman as his niece, Peg Entwistle. The police determined that she had climbed to the top of the H and jumped off the top of the letter and died. She climbed a workman's ladder on the back of the H. The police were able to determine that she jumped off the giant H because of the location of her jacket, shoe, and purse at the base of the letter H. The suicide note, which was in her purse, read, "I am afraid I am a coward. I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain. P.E." I just covered city landmarks on the East Coast and West Coast. Let's turn to the middle of the country, St. Louis. If you've ever been to St. Louis, or even seen photos of that city, you know that it is dominated by a gigantic metal monument called the Gateway Arch. The arch is situated in Gateway Arch National Park. Originally, this was called the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. The national park is located where the city of St. Louis was founded in 1764. When the city was founded, it was not part of the United States because the U.S. was not a country until 1776. Even when the United States achieved its independence after the Revolution and the borders for the new country were set in 1783, St. Louis was still not in the United States. St. Louis was part of what was called the Louisiana Territory. The reason why this national park was originally called the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial is because Thomas Jefferson was instrumental in acquiring this land for the United States. Here's a quick history lesson on the Louisiana Purchase. The 1783 Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution. As part of that treaty, the boundaries of the new United States were set. The western boundary of the new country was the Mississippi River. Thomas Jefferson wanted to purchase New Orleans from the French because that city controlled the entrance and exit to the Mississippi River. He sent James Monroe to Paris to assist the American minister to the court of Napoleon, Robert Livingston, to try to buy New Orleans. One of those names you probably recognize. James Monroe was later the 5th president of the United States and is famous for the Monroe Doctrine. You may not recognize the name of Robert Livingston, but he was on the Committee of Five, which was tasked with drafting the Declaration of Independence. The other 4 members were Ben Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Thomas Jefferson. And as you probably know, Jefferson wrote most of the Declaration of Independence. Fun fact. On April 30, 1789, Robert Livingston, in his capacity as Chancellor of the state of New York, administered the oath of office to George Washington when he was inaugurated as the first president. We now have the Chief Justice swearing the president, but at that time, there was no Chief Justice because the Supreme Court had not been invented yet. Although the Supreme Court is established in the U.S. Constitution, it did not become a reality until the passage of the Judiciary Act of 1789, and justices were first sworn in beginning October 1789. Getting back to the Louisiana Purchase, when the American diplomats offered to buy New Orleans, the French Treasury Minister offered to sell all of the Louisiana Territory to the United States. Why was this? Well, in 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte was in the middle of his ongoing wars with most of Europe and needed money desperately. So a deal was struck that the United States would pay $15 million to France in exchange for the enormous Louisiana Territory. The Louisiana Purchase essentially doubled the size of the United States. The territory that was called Louisiana covered all or part of the following states: Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Missouri, Kansas, Colorado, Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. The French did not really control this expansive region known as the Louisiana Territory. The French just controlled New Orleans and parts of what now make up the state of Louisiana. All of those other states I just mentioned had very few Europeans from any country. This vast area was mostly occupied by Native Americans. And of course, the Native Americans were not consulted regarding the purchase of this giant area, which is now considered the Central Plains of the United States. Getting back to today's topic, the small outpost town of St. Louis now belonged to the United States. St. Louis had approximately 1,000 residents when it joined the U.S. In 1804, President Jefferson asked Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to lead a group of explorers, which Jefferson entitled the Corps of Discovery, to explore the Louisiana Territory and to find a path to the Pacific Ocean. The exploration of the Louisiana Territory began in St. Louis. It was the starting point because St. Louis is located where the 2 biggest rivers in the United States come together. It's where the Missouri River empties into the Mississippi. Second fun fact, the Missouri is the longest river in North America. Most people think the Mississippi is the longest. Not true. According to the National Park Service, the Mississippi River is 2,350 miles long, but the National Park Service states that the Missouri River is approximately 100 miles longer than the Mississippi. Getting back to today's topic, how did this enormous project, known as the Gateway Arch, get started? In 1935, Luther Eli Smith, an attorney in St. Louis, proposed to the mayor that the dilapidated riverfront buildings should be knocked down and replaced with an appropriate monument. This was the height of the Depression. Luther Eli Smith went to Washington, D.C. and got the federal government to agree to pay for 3/4 of the expense for the park and the monument. St. Louis would pay the last quarter of the estimated $30 million for the project. In 1937, the acquisition of the land began. It took several years to buy out all of the property owners, many of whom were very unwilling to sell. In December 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the United States entered World War II. This resulted in tremendous delays for building the memorial. After World War II, Luther Eli Smith tried to rekindle the movement for the monument. Smith started raising money again. In 1947, a nationwide architectural competition was held to design an appropriate monument. Prizes were offered totaling $125,000. That would be approximately $1.6 million in today's money. Various prominent architects submitted drastically different designs for the monument. 172 entries were submitted by the September 1, 1947 deadline. There were various ideas for the monument, including a pyramid, a lighthouse, and even a man-made waterfall. 5 finalists were selected, and those architects were invited to submit further drawings for their ideas for the monument. One of those 5 finalists was a 37-year-old architect named Eero Saarinen, who conceived of a giant stainless steel arch for the monument. Eero Saarinen had been born in Finland and moved with his family to the U.S. when he was 13 years old. In 1948, the committee selected the bold vision of an enormous arch as an expression of a gateway. A problem arose when a man named Gilmore Clark claimed that Eero Saarinen had copied a design for a giant arch which Benito Mussolini had proposed to build in Rome. This created a lot of controversy because nobody wants to copy a fascist symbol. It was all nonsense. First of all, Mussolini's proposed arch was never built. Second, the proposed fascist arch for Rome was much shorter and wider. It may have been an arch, but the shape was drastically different. When these points were made to the public, the controversy died down and the Gateway Arch project went ahead. Construction did not begin until 1959, when the remaining federal money was allocated for the project. On a sad note, Eero Saarinen, the architect who designed the arch, died of a brain tumor in 1961. The Gateway Arch was completed on October 28, 1965. The tram for going up inside the arch opened in 1967. Let's talk about some of the details of this magnificent landmark. Since it was built to commemorate westward expansion, it is situated to face due east and due west. The arch is 630 feet tall and is America's tallest national monument. In a cool bit of symmetry, the 630 feet height is exactly matched by the width of the arch. It's made out of polished stainless steel, and that's why it reflects the light so well. The shape of the arch is an inverted catenary curve. A catenary is the curve that a hanging chain or flexible cable or rope assumes under its own weight when supported only at its ends. So that's the definition of the curve in the Gateway Arch, but upside down. The Gateway Arch is a mirror image of a catenary curve. The arch is hollow. This allows people to go up inside. Approximately 1 million people go to the top of the arch every year. I've been to the top of the Gateway Arch twice, and it is awesome. You go up inside these little tram cars that are like space capsules. There are 2 separate trams, one in each leg of the arch. They act independently. The tram operates kind of like a Ferris wheel. You know how when you're sitting in a cart on a Ferris wheel, your seat always stays upright. If the cart on the Ferris wheel was not loose, but was rigidly fixed to the Ferris wheel, you would turn upside down when you reached the top and you would fall out. The tram cars in the Gateway Arch act the same way. They are loosely attached to the tracks. The difference is that the tram cars are completely enclosed, but they do remain upright from the bottom of the leg of the arch all the way to the top. There are also sets of stairs for emergencies. If you wanted to climb the stairs, it would be 1,076 steps. When you get to the top of the observation room, there are windows facing both west and east. It's an odd sensation when you look down because there's nothing right below you. Normally, when you are high up in a building, the structure that's holding you up is directly beneath you. But in the arch, the 2 legs go out to each side and there's nothing when you look straight down. It's a very cool effect. The next city landmark we're going to discuss was built as part of a World's Fair. If you're not a baby boomer, you're probably not familiar with World's Fairs. They were popular in the 19th and 20th centuries. A World's Fair was an international exhibition which was supposed to show off the scientific, technological, industrial, and artistic achievements of the participating nations. A World's Fair usually lasted around 5 to 6 months. When I was 7 years old, I went to the New York World's Fair in 1965. If you're ever driving on one of the interstates in Queens, New York, you can see a 120-foot diameter stainless steel globe in Flushing Meadows Corona Park. It's called the Unisphere, and it was the theme symbol for the 1964 to 1965 New York World's Fair. Most World's Fairs wanted to have a dramatic symbol for that particular fair. In 1962, Seattle hosted a World's Fair. The impressive monument for that World's Fair became the most recognizable landmark for the city of Seattle. Of course, I'm talking about the Space Needle. The official name was the Century 21 Exposition, but most people just call it the Seattle World's Fair. The Seattle World's Fair was held between April 21 and October 21, 1962, and drew almost 10 million visitors. The theme for the fair centered on modern science, space exploration, and the progressive future. The centerpiece and the symbol of the World's Fair was the Space Needle. The Space Needle is 605 feet tall, 138 feet wide, weighs 9,550 tons, and is built to withstand winds of up to 200 miles per hour and earthquakes of up to 9.0 magnitude. When it opened in 1962, the Space Needle was the tallest structure west of the Mississippi River. It did not hold the record for very long. As I just explained, the Gateway Arch was completed in St. Louis in 1965, and it is 25 feet taller than the Space Needle. The Space Needle is not even the tallest structure in Seattle anymore. There are several buildings in downtown Seattle which are taller. Fortunately, the Space Needle has a great location. The old World's Fair grounds are now called Seattle Center. That's an arts, educational, tourism, and entertainment center in Seattle. Seattle Center is about a mile or so north of downtown Seattle, where all of the tall buildings are located. This means that even though there are taller buildings than the Space Needle, there is nothing tall in the immediate vicinity of the Space Needle. That's why the Space Needle still stands out, because it's not surrounded by any tall buildings. Essentially, the Space Needle is an observation tower. It was built at the beginning of the space race between the US and the Soviet Union. The Space Needle was designed to have a very futuristic look. There are 3 main supporting legs which start spread out on the ground and then bend inwards about halfway up the structure and then spread out again to support the round observation deck on top. The observation deck was purposely built to look like a flying saucer. The term saucer doesn't come up much in modern times, but it was one of those little round dishes you put under a coffee cup or a teacup to catch any spills. You don't hear that term flying saucer anymore, but it was a popular term in the 1950s and 60s to describe a disc-shaped flying object. Supposedly, the term originated from an incident on June 24, 1947. An amateur pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying his airplane over Washington State when he claimed he saw some unidentified flying objects, which he later described as flying like a saucer if you skip it across the water. That was supposedly the origin of the term flying saucer. That is why in those 1950s sci-fi movies involving aliens, their spacecrafts are all shaped like a disc or a saucer. This was the inspiration for the design of the Space Needle observation deck. The Space Needle was finished in less than 1 year. It was completed in April 1962, just in time for the opening of the World's Fair. The cost to build the Space Needle was $4.5 million. That would be equivalent to about $40 million in today's money. The Space Needle features an observation deck 520 feet above the ground with fantastic views of the Seattle skyline, the Olympic and Cascade Mountains, Mount Rainier, and Puget Sound. In the center of the 3 support legs, there is a vertical column containing stairs and elevators. If you want to take the stairs from the ground to the top of the observation deck, there are 848 steps. Most people take one of the 3 elevators, which takes 41 seconds to reach the observation deck. When it opened, the paint on the Space Needle was described as having these colors: orbital olive for the body, astronaut white for the legs, re-entry red for the saucer, and galaxy gold for the roof. They were very committed to the space age theme. Of course, the Space Needle has been updated over the years. On the observation deck, you'll now find the only revolving glass floor in the world. On May 19, 2007, the Space Needle welcomed its 45 millionth visitor. Besides the Space Needle, another remnant from the 1962 World's Fair is the Seattle Center monorail. The monorail only goes 9/10 of a mile from the Space Needle to downtown Seattle. It was built for the World's Fair, but it's still in use today. Here's an odd thing connected to the Century 21 exposition. Elvis Presley made a movie which debuted in 1963 called It Happened at the World's Fair. And relating to today's topic, there is a scene with Elvis having dinner with a pretty woman in the restaurant on top of the Space Needle. As I mentioned earlier, the Seattle World's Fair opened on April 21, 1962. JFK was president and officially opened the World's Fair, but not in person. Kennedy was in Palm Beach, Florida. He delivered his remarks over the telephone and pressed a telegraph key in Palm Beach, which officially opened the fair via satellite. Although he was not there for the grand opening, President Kennedy promised to be present in Seattle for the closing of the World's Fair on October 21, 1962. He was unable to keep that promise. JFK's people told the Seattle organizers that he had a bad cold and could not travel to Seattle. In reality, he was dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you're unfamiliar with that term, it references a 13-day period in October 1962 when the world came close to nuclear Armageddon. I know that sounds like hyperbole, but it is true. It's a long and complicated story, but here are the essential points. On October 16, 1962, President Kennedy was shown photographs taken by American U-2 spy planes that showed that the Soviet Union was constructing ballistic missile bases in Cuba. President Kennedy gave a televised address on October 22 announcing a quarantine of Cuba. This meant that the Soviets could not send any materials for nuclear missiles to Cuba. This led to a very tense standoff where the world was on the brink of a nuclear war between the two superpowers. After several tense days, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a promise that the U.S. would not invade Cuba, along with a secret deal that the U.S. would remove its missiles from Turkey. This is why President Kennedy was not present for the closing ceremonies of the Seattle World's Fair on October 21, 1962. No city has more distinguishing landmarks than Washington, D.C. First, you have buildings like the U.S. Capitol and the White House, which are recognized all over the world. And of course, there are plenty of shrines to great Americans. By far my favorite is the Lincoln Memorial, mostly because he's my favorite person in history, but also because the memorial is just so well done. But I think the most recognizable landmark, not counting occupied buildings, is the Washington Monument. Number one, it's the oldest of the monuments in D.C. There are older buildings like the Capitol and the White House, but it was the first memorial. Number two, it's by far the tallest and can be seen from just about anywhere in the city. One of the cool things about Washington, D.C. is the fact that there are no tall buildings. There's a myth that nothing can be taller than the Washington Monument. That's not true. The height restrictions in D.C. have nothing to do with the Washington Monument. According to the National Capital Planning Commission website, the Height of Buildings Act of 1910 is a federal law which imposes maximum heights on buildings within Washington, D.C. based upon the width of the street to a maximum of 130 feet on commercial streets and 90 feet on residential streets and 160 feet for parts of Pennsylvania Avenue. There are actually some exceptions to that Height of Buildings Act of 1910. But still, the Washington Monument towers over everything else in D.C. The fact that it is isolated on the National Mall with no other buildings around it makes the Washington Monument seem even that much more impressive. Before we take a look at the history of the Washington Monument, let's first delve into the history of the American Capitol. What makes it a unique city is that it was completely planned. Most cities just grow organically, starting from a small settlement, and they keep expanding. The location and the layout of Washington were both planned. First, let's deal with the location. I mentioned earlier that George Washington was inaugurated as president in New York City. That's because New York was the capital of the U.S. in 1789. The federal capital moved out of New York as a bargain between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. The federal capital was first moved to Philadelphia from 1790 to 1800, and then the new federal capital opened in what's now Washington, D.C. President Washington selected the actual location for the new city, which would be the permanent capital. Washington chose the locale where the Anacostia River flows into the Potomac River. The Potomac is deep and very navigable at this location to provide easy access by ships from the new capital down to the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. The federal district would be a square of 10 miles on each side. The land was ceded from Maryland and Virginia, and the federal district would not be part of any state. Anybody who has looked at a map of Washington, D.C. knows that the District of Columbia is not a square. It has 3 straight lines with Maryland surrounding it and the Potomac River as its fourth border, with Virginia on the other side of the river. That's because in 1847, the portion of the District of Columbia on the southwest side of the Potomac River was given back to the state of Virginia. Once President Washington selected the location for the new capital, the city was founded on July 16, 1790. As I told you earlier, the city was laid out completely in advance. President Washington appointed Pierre Charles L'Enfant to design the city plan. L'Enfant wanted the new American city to be reminiscent of his native Paris. L'Enfant had the idea of what is now called the National Mall, that large expanse of grass, trees, and sidewalks that runs west from the Capitol. When people eventually planned on erecting a memorial to George Washington, they selected that spot of open space on the National Mall, which is directly west of the Capitol building and directly south of the White House. In actuality, the Washington Monument is not located in the exact spot where those two lines meet, but it's close enough. Where the Washington Monument is currently located was right next to the Potomac River at that time. And for those of you familiar with D.C., you're saying, hey, the Washington Monument isn't next to the Potomac. That's right. Land was later claimed from the Potomac, which extended the National Mall westward from the Washington Monument to the area where the Lincoln Memorial is now located. Before we talk about the giant obelisk we all know as the Washington Monument in the center of the District of Columbia, here's an odd tidbit. There is another Washington Monument, but not in D.C. It was built in the middle of Baltimore at the intersection of Mount Vernon Place and Washington Place. People can climb the 227 steps to the top for a view of Baltimore. It is a 178-foot, 8-inch Doric column with a ground floor gallery and a statue of America's first president on top. And here is the best part. The statue on top of that giant column in Baltimore has George Washington wearing sandals and a Roman toga. I'm not kidding. How great is that? It is very confusing that the structure in Baltimore is also called the Washington Monument, but it was the first one. It was begun in 1815 and completed in 1829. That means that the Baltimore Washington Monument was completed 19 years before the Washington Monument in D.C. was even begun. Now that I've taken you on that little detour about the Baltimore version of the Washington Monument, let's get back to the famous Washington Monument found on the National Mall. The original design for the Washington Monument was built by an architect named Robert Mills. Actually, he designed both the Washington Monument in Baltimore as well as the Washington Monument located on the National Mall in D.C. He planned to have a 600-foot Egyptian-style obelisk surrounded at the base with a giant circular building with columns. The building would be 250 feet in diameter and 100 feet tall. Eventually, the design was simplified, eliminating the colonnaded building and leaving only the obelisk. Further, the obelisk was shortened from the original proposed 600 feet. A private organization called the Washington National Monument Society raised funds for the construction of the monument. Construction started in 1848. The cornerstone was laid on July 4, 1848, with approximately 20,000 people in attendance, including President James K. Polk, as well as future presidents James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, and Abraham Lincoln. Construction was slow and came to a complete stop in 1854 when the Washington National Monument Society ran out of funds and went bankrupt. At the time, the Washington Monument was 156 feet tall, which was only approximately one-third of its eventual height. The unfinished monument remained in this incomplete state until 1876. At that time, the federal government assumed the duty of funding and building the Washington Monument. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers took over the construction. This was a good thing because the Army Corps of Engineers determined that the foundation was insufficient for holding up the immense weight of the structure, so they strengthened the foundation before they started adding to the height of the monument. The Washington Monument is constructed of granite with an exterior face of marble. Because there was a gap of over 2 decades in construction, the stone quarry near Baltimore, which provided the marble for the initial construction, was no longer available. The engineers could not match the new stone to the original stone used prior to 1854. They did the best they could. Initially, the stone used during the second phase of construction seemed to match the stone from the first phase of the construction. However, over time, the wind, rain, and erosion caused the 2 marble sections to weather differently. That is why now, even with the naked eye, you can look and see that the color of the stone changes for the upper 2/3. And if you look closely, there is actually a third color of marble at the dividing line between the 2 main phases of construction. That was because when construction began for the second phase by the Army Corps of Engineers, they used marble from a particular stone quarry in Massachusetts for a short time. Although the original plan was that the obelisk would be 600 feet tall, the man from the Army Corps of Engineers who was in charge of the project, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lincoln Casey, decided that a better ratio would be to have the height be 10 times the width of the base. That is why Casey decided that the height would be 555 feet. On December 6, 1884, Lieutenant Colonel Casey supervised the placement of the 3,300-pound capstone. Casey then placed the 8.9-inch aluminum tip atop the capstone. Inscribed on the aluminum cap are names and dates relating to the monument's construction, and on the east face of the aluminum cap, facing the rising sun, are the words Laus Deo, which is Latin for Praise be to God. The Washington Monument was dedicated on February 21, 1885. They wanted to dedicate the monument on George Washington's birthday, which is February 22nd. But they did not want to have the ceremony on a Sunday, so the dedication was held on Saturday, February 21. The Washington Monument was first accessible to the public in 1886 after an iron staircase was built into the interior so people could go to the top and look out of the windows on all 4 sides. In 1888, an elevator was installed. If you have an opportunity to do so, I would highly recommend going to the top of the Washington Monument. The views are fantastic. The National Park Service provides these statistics for the Washington Monument. There are over 36,000 stones in the structure. It has 897 steps. The above ground portion has an estimated weight of over 80,000 tons. Steel beams were used to support the elevator shaft, but the structural elements of the Washington Monument are entirely stone. Also, according to the National Park Service, the official measurement of the Washington Monument is 555 feet, 5 1/8 inches. When it was completed in 1884, it was the tallest structure in the world. It only held that title for 5 years because in 1889, the Eiffel Tower opened in Paris. The Washington Monument is the largest obelisk in the world, and more impressively, it's the tallest stone structure on Earth. Well, that's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Ratings and likes greatly help for the popularity of my podcast. If you're listening on a podcast app like Spotify or Apple, which allows for ratings, I'd greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Some apps allow for reviews, and I'd also greatly appreciate a kind review. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Check out my website, historyanalyze.com, where you will find links to my podcast episodes, as well as fun items for all of the history geeks. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.